Hanging, just waiting for everything to sync. Woo! And we have synced. Oh, there you go. All righty. I want to welcome everybody to Project Inspire, everything you ever want to know about the oral law. My name's Tzvi Gluckin. Hang on a second. They advertised me as a musician, right? Oh, sorry, I got a reed blown out on my harmonica. Worst things can happen, I guess, right? Anyways, I'm Tzvi Gluckin, coming to you live from Boston, Massachusetts. We're going to be speaking about some deep ideas that should shake you to the core of your being. We'll be speaking about the oral law, and that's that. Do you mind if I show a slideshow? Is that fine? Everybody's cool with that? I guess you're going to have to be. Hang on. Here we go. These are my shots. That's me. I'm Tzvi Gluckin. And if there's any questions, that doesn't really matter. All right. My name's Tzvi Gluckin. I'm in Boston, Massachusetts. If you want to find out more about me, especially the music writing I do and the freelance journalism I do, check it out at my website, gluckin.com. Also, you can find me at the ingathering.substack.com, which is a weekly newsletter dedicated to everything you ever want to know about Jewish music and spirituality. We have features and interviews with Jewish artists, people who are currently active on the scene today, historical pieces about things that you want to know about in terms of Jewish music throughout the ages. What else? Roundups of great music you need to hear, particularly new stuff and cool stuff. And then finally, short essays and Divrei Torah about the inherent spiritual nature of music and how those different things work together. It's actually fascinating and fabulous, and you will totally love it. And because I'm cool, so the music that we feature is cool music. Nothing cheesy, nothing sappy, I hope. Unless, of course, the spirit moves me and I'm feeling cheesy and sappy, but it hasn't happened yet. Anyway, so check that out. I'll give you all these things again at the end. But today, we're not talking about music or spirituality. Well, everything spiritual, I guess. Today we're going to be speaking about the oral law, understanding the oral law, understanding what it is, how it functions, how it works, and hopefully answer some obvious questions that people have. The most basic and obvious question, which is what it really is the focus of today's lengthy dissertation, or not so lengthy, depending on our feelings. But it's like this. Let's pretend you know God exists, God runs the world, God gave his Torah to the Jewish people. We know the Torah is unchanged. Wonderful. Okay, what about, that doesn't mean anything necessarily, because just because we have a Torah, the same Torah that we have and we use as the Jewish people as the basis for our belief and the basis for how we see the world and interact with the world, lots of other people use that same Torah and use the verses to prove what they want to believe as well. And what's interesting is that if you just read the verses and you take them at face value with no additional explanation, nobody filling in the blanks, nobody explaining the obvious inconsistencies or grammatical issues or juxtapositions or areas that are particularly terse versus areas that are particularly lengthy, yada, 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 yada. No, just explains it to you. How do you can't really make heads or tails of it, and so you can interpret it to say whatever you want it to say. The Torah is poetic enough, vague enough, and allegorical enough that you can twist it and make it say anything, and lots of people do. Everything from mainstream religions and belief systems in our world today to very fringe outsider belief systems and everything in between. They're all using the same Torah to prove and to give a scriptural basis for the beliefs. How do we know we're right? We have our beliefs. We have our way of reading the Torah. How do we know the Jewish belief system or the Jewish understanding? I don't want to say interpretation, it's kind of not really accurate, but the Jewish understanding of the verses. How do we know that it's the right one? Maybe we're not. I don't know. We'll explore that. A better question, though, And even if I could prove to you, even if I could demonstrate that our Torah is the Torah that, our oral law rather is the correct interpretation, and it's a correct understanding of what the verses are saying, still been around a long time. I mean, the oral law was written down. I use that in quotes because we wrote the oral law, which is interesting paradox, interesting usage of language. But the oral law is 2,000 years, 1,500 years ago is the conclusion of the Talmud. I mean, been around a long time. How do you know it didn't change? Just because we could say it's true or it's right, how do you know it didn't change over all these years? How do you know that the oral law we are using today is basically the one we started out with? So that's what we're going to be dealing with and discussing today in our talk. First thing I want to demonstrate, though, before we even get into the oral law and how we know it hasn't changed, realize that the oral law is with us whether you like it or not. And whether you grew up in a religious home or you've never been, or you've been only had a very, what's the word I'm looking for? A very limited experience with Judaism. If you interacted with Jewish experience, Jewish life, Jewish lifestyle events in any way, shape, or form, you've interacted with the oral law. It's everywhere. It's prevalent. It's unavoidable. So, for example, if you've ever been to a Passover Seder, and I have a picture here of a Seder. That's not my family Seder, but okay, whatever. Anyways, if you've been to a Pesach Seder, a Passover Seder, you've interacted with the oral law. What's the Torah say? Torah tells you about the Exodus from Egypt. It says that the people in the story, they slaughtered a lamb, put blood on the doorposts of their houses. They sat in their house with the staff in their hand, sitting straight up at the table, eating lamb and matzah while the angel of death flew over the house and was smoting the Egyptians. Is that what we do today? Are there any Egyptians being smote while we're having our Passover Seder? No, but not only that, we recline and we ask the 4 questions. We read from a Haggadah. Where's all this stuff come from? The only thing it says in the Torah is tell it to your children. Tell what to your children? Okay. So this is how we tell it. That's the oral law. The oral law fills in all those blanks and tells you how to tell it to your children. So you're telling your children what happened to us on that night and the basis for our belief system. Okay, the bar mitzvah. Do you ever, what's it say in the Torah about a bar mitzvah? Nothing. Bubkis, shum davar, klum, gornish. Ain't no thing. It's not there, right? It's not there. There's some hints that we can maybe get into if anybody wants to go wade into the weeds of Talmudic law. But generally speaking, bar bat mitzvah, bar bas mitzvah is not mentioned in the Torah at all. Even the name bar mitzvah is not a Hebrew word. Bar is Aramaic, and it just means that somebody becomes obligated in the mitzvah. So if you've interacted with that, if you turn 13 or 12 if you're a girl and you had a bar bat mitzvah, so you've interacted with oral law as well. Not to mention all the rabbinical things that we have throughout our history, like Hanukkah and Purim and all these things. So anyway, so oral law is something that is intrinsic to the Jewish experience. And if you've experienced Judaism, you've experienced the oral law. More than that, the Torah seems to assume that there's an oral law. This is the mitzvah of mezuzah. If you've ever gone to a Jewish home, or maybe in your Jewish home, you have a mezuzah on the doorpost. Okay, here's what it says in the Torah. It says, this is Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 9. Write them on the doorposts of your house and upon your gates. And that's it. Write what? That's all it says. It's actually referring to the verse before, verse 2 before it says, write these words. Write what words? Write what words? That's all it says. And unfortunately, the Torah, the written Torah makes the mistake of giving us a pronoun without actually first telling us the proper noun. So write what? So, and it's actually fascinating. There's a heretical sect called the Karaites. They still exist on some level. They believe the written law, not the oral law. So, okay, they had to deal with this verse as well. So what did they do? So they write the 10 Commandments on their doorpost. Now, how do they know that write them is referring to the 10 Commandments? I don't know. It's an interpretation. It's an oral law, whether they believe it or not. There's a book that was funny for like the first 5 pages. It's not really that good, called The Year of Living Biblically. A guy who decides to live every verse of the Torah literally. And same thing, he gets to this verse, doesn't know what to do, so he writes the 10 Commandments on his doorpost. I don't know why people choose the 10 Commandments, but okay, it's not for me. Anyways, bottom line, though, is that the written law here seems to assume that there's some type of explanation. Someone's going to tell you what that pronoun is, and you'll come to see that it's actually mezuzah we know and love today. You look at a Torah scroll, there's no dots. Okay, so when it tells about the holiday of Sukkot, how do you know it doesn't say Sicha? And we should all lie on beds of nails. I don't know. Okay, the best one is this one here, though. Slaughter. The Torah says, this is Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 21, where it says, you may slaughter your animals in the manner that I have commanded you. And that's it. If you've ever learned the laws of slaughtering animals, you'll know that the laws of slaughtering animals are actually relatively complex. There's 5 different ways. You have to, the large animals, the majority of the trachea and the esophagus, smaller animals, all of those things. There's 5 ways that you can render that slaughter invalid. If you have concerns about the animal, so you need to, if you have concerns about the animal, so you need to you need to examine 70 different organs, 70 types of blemishes that could render the animal inedible. What does it say in the Torah? It's a whole complex law, and what does it say in the Torah? This: slaughter the animals in the manner that I've commanded you. Obviously, it's implicit in the language here that there is some type of oral explanation. So that's the bottom line. The Torah seems to be assuming there's an oral explanation that goes along to explain what these written verses are talking about. Let's take this a step further, because oral laws are actually normal to all societies. For example, if you want to learn how to read these letters, it's impossible to do without somebody explaining it to you. True, once you learn one language, you can, at least in theory, you can figure out all the rest. It's actually a little harder than you would think, but in theory, you can figure out all the rest. But someone has to explain what these letters mean. Someone has to show you A is A, B is B, C is S, or K, depending on context, D is D, and that's it. Someone has to show it to you. There's a famous story in the Talmud about the great sage Hillel. A non-Jew comes to Hillel and he says, Hillel, I'm going to convert to Judaism if you can teach me the whole Torah, but I only want the written Torah, not the oral law. So Hillel says, great, okay, I'll give you that. And he does the same thing. He says, you have to learn to read. You want to learn the written law, you have to learn to read. So here's an aleph, a, base, ba, gimel, ga, Dala, duh. Come back tomorrow, I'll give you more letters. The guy comes back the next day and he tells Hillel the letters. Hillel's like, what are you talking about? That's not the letters that I showed you. The first letter is ta, and then sha, and then ra, then ka. The guy's all flabbergasted. And Hillel says, if you can't trust me for the pronunciation of the letters, how are you going to know how to put those letters together to make words, and what those words mean, and how the grammar works, and how they work in context, and ultimately what the Torah is teaching you, what you're supposed to glean from it? In other words, without some type of oral explanation, it's impossible to make heads or tails of the Torah and to have any understanding of what it's speaking about. And more than that, that's how you learn language. That's how we understand things. And when you hear things orally, when someone speaks incorrectly, it sounds wrong. And you know that. Okay. How do you know? And we transmit this stuff, obviously, from parent to child and also in school. So how do you know your kindergarten teacher didn't lie to you? So that you trust your teacher. And the reason you trust your teacher is because it's easy to corroborate and there's no secret information. So if you go to school and your teacher's that rebel teacher teaching the wrong math or teaching the wrong pronunciation of the letter. So what's going to happen? You'll be with your friends on the playground and you'll say something wrong and everybody will make fun of you. You go home to do your homework with your parents or siblings or an uncle or whatever, and it's the new math. Everybody, it's not going to last because it's common knowledge. What your teacher's teaching you is not this secret information. Your teacher's teaching you this common knowledge that you can corroborate very easily in the world around you. So you can trust your kindergarten teacher because of that. Steve Martin, the comedian, used to have this joke that if you want to play a joke on little kids, what you do is whenever you're around them, you talk wrong. So when they go to their first day in school, they have to go to the bathroom, they raise their hand, "Meow, mama, dog face, the banana patch." Get that kid out of here, Anyways, that's a joke because it's ridiculous, obviously. The way we learn and the way we're able to understand what someone is saying and the way we're able to transmit our knowledge is because it's done orally. More than that, it's not just things like math and language, it's how we function in society as well. For example, the way you behave on a date or the way you act at a job interview, these are lessons that you pick up and learn in society. And if you don't behave correctly or properly in these situations, no one will go out with you or you'll never get any work. Because I heard once a story on NPR, so it's got to be true, right? I heard it on NPR there was there's a gang problem in LA, and so they had convinced these local businesses, not like stores. I think it was more executive, more office type work. They had convinced these businesses to hire kids from the gangs for the summer to get them off the street, and so the kids would work in the businesses instead of getting up to trouble over the summer. And so everybody agreed, fine. The one catch was the businesses didn't want to just hire these kids. They were going to give them jobs, but they had to go through the application process and go to interviews. As the summer wore on, none of the kids got hired. How come? Because the way they didn't know, they never had this transmission of how to behave on a job interview. The way you act on the street, what's cool on the street, how you dress, how you hold yourself, how you speak on the street is very different than the way you behave in a job interview. And so all these people conducting the interviews were terrified and didn't hire any of these kids. Needless to say, these are things that you pick up and you learn orally. It's true that there may be books about how to act on a date or a job interview, but generally speaking, those types of books look at behavior, look at how people interact in the real world, and then write books based on best practices. But the actual behaviors themselves are things that are transmitted orally. The final thing I want to say about the oral law is that oral law, not only is oral law something which is everywhere and how we learn and how we behave, but it's binding as well. So I'll give you an example. I have here a picture of somebody driving. So if you learn to drive, there are certain laws that are on the books that everybody knows. And they're on the books and they're enforceable as laws. For example, don't pass on a double yellow line, obey the speed limit, come to a full stop at a stop sign. Here in Boston, people do the Boston coast. You get to the stop sign, you slow down and coast through okay, you get a ticket for that though if a cop catches you, because a stop sign means come to a full stop, look both ways, and then go. Double line, you try to pass on a double yellow line, you're gonna get a ticket because those are laws that are on the book. Great. All right. What about oral law? So anybody know? Answer this to yourself. Anybody know what's considered keeping a safe distance when you're driving on the highway? Safe distance. I have been shocked. I used to think this was common knowledge, but it's apparently only common knowledge if you're from New Jersey. I grew up in New Jersey, so people in New Jersey are obviously the best drivers because they know this rule. The rest of the country, you're a bunch of bums. Get off the road. But a safe distance when you're driving is 1 car length for every 10 miles an hour. I hope everybody knows that. 1 car length for every 10 miles an hour. So if you're going 60 miles an hour, you should keep 6 car lengths between you and the car in front of you. Why is that? Because it gives you enough time to react. So for example, you're on the highway and there's a car in front of you and you're going 60, you're keeping 6 car lengths. Car in front of you slams on his brakes. You have enough time to put down your phone, stop texting, notice what's going on. I'm joking, by the way. Notice what's going on, slam on the brakes, and not hit the car in front of you. Okay, that's an idea of an oral law. Now, here's the thing about that. The cop catches you going 4 car lengths instead of 6 when you're going 60 miles an hour. You're going to get a ticket? Very unlikely. I mean, if you're right up the person's butt, so you might get a ticket for reckless driving, but generally speaking, you won't get a ticket if you're not exactly 1 car length for every 10 miles an hour. But what if, God forbid, you get into an accident? The insurance company may not cover you. How come? Because if you rear end somebody, it's your fault. Why is it your fault? You weren't keeping a safe distance. Had you been keeping a safe distance, you would have been able to react on time and stop at the right time, and you wouldn't have gotten in the accident. Isn't that incredible? Isn't that incredible? So it's an oral law. It's not on the books, but everybody knows it, and it's binding. It's legally binding, and it could mess you up. So anyways, that's basically what oral laws are and how we deal with them. Okay, so what's the genesis of the oral law in Judaism? Here's a picture of Moses up on Mount Sinai. It's not really Moses. It's Mel Brooks dressed as Moses. Sorry about that. Anyway, so on Mount Sinai. So when we oftentimes when we hang out in the Jewish world, we'll talk about how Moses got the Torah at Mount Sinai. Obviously, what did Moses really get at Mount Sinai? He couldn't have gotten the 5 books of Moses that we have today. How come? Because the Mount Sinai, the experience at Mount Sinai, that first Shavuos, was at the beginning, right? You know, it was 50 days after getting out of Egypt. It was right at the beginning of the 40 years of wandering in the desert. Half the Torah is about the 40 years of wandering in the desert, including Moses getting punished. What's Moses going to be like? I don't want to go to Israel, but the thing says I hit the rock, but I don't want to hit the rock. I'm going to go to Israel. Like, you know what I'm saying? You would read the book if you got it. So what did he get at Mount Sinai? Matter of fact, we have tradition. If you want to look, people out there who are Talmudic scholars or biblical scholars, you look in the great commentator Rashi, look at his commentary on some of the verses before Mount Sinai at the bitter waters. It seems that we already got a chunk of the Torah already. What did we get at Mount Sinai? Or what did we have by the time we finished Mount Sinai? Probably had the book of Genesis, the book of Exodus, which is the story of how they got to Mount Sinai. Probably most of the book of Leviticus, which is just lists of laws, is very little narrative. But the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy, Numbers being the wandering for 40 years in the desert, and Deuteronomy, Moses' last speech, the last 40 days of his life. So unlikely they got that at Mount Sinai. So when we say we got the Torah at Mount Sinai, what is it that we got? Can't be the whole 5 books of Moses. What did we get? The oral law. The oral law. Judaism is the oral law. Judaism is the oral law. What's the written law? The written law is an outline, a beautiful, amazing, powerful outline, but it's an outline to guarantee you don't forget the essence of Judaism, which is the oral law. And that explains so much about the written Torah, why it is so terse in its language someplace, but needlessly repetitive and redundant in other places, why some weird things are juxtaposed the way they are, why there's grammatical inconsistencies or unusual ways of using words that aren't used normally in language, and on and on and on, because it reads like an outline. If you read it like an outline, it's just cueing you, turning you on to the ideas in the oral law that you're supposed to know. Wow. So we have a written law, we have an oral law. What is the joy of studying the Torah? The joy, and take this out, check this out. Everybody knows written law. We have it. We have the outline. Everybody knows the oral law because that's what you do. That's how you live Judaism. The joy of studying the Torah is finding the source, seeing where the oral law is in the outline, in the written law. I'll give you some examples. Famous example is in the Talmud. I believe it is in Menachos, if somebody wants to look it up. So the Torah says that if you look in the Torah, all the holidays have dates. Rosh Hashanah is the 1st of the month, Yom Kippur is the 10th, Passover is the 15th, except Shavuos, or as we say in English, Pentecost. So Shavuos doesn't have a date. What's the Torah say? You start counting from the day after Passover. You count 50 days, and 50 days after Passover is when you have the holiday of Shavuos, and that's when we celebrate. Fantastic. Okay, what's the problem? The written Torah doesn't actually say count from the day after Passover. It says start counting from Shabbos. Shabbos. Okay, we know through the oral law that when the Torah says Shabbos, it means Passover, and that's when you start counting. There's a lot of beautiful mystical reasons why that's the fact, but it doesn't say anything else. How do you know that when the Torah said Shabbos, it means Passover? Maybe it be any Shabbos. Maybe it be the Shabbos after Passover, so Passover will always be on a Sunday. Maybe it's the Shabbos after Sukkot, and it's in the middle of the winter. Maybe just some random Shabbos in the year when you feel the Spirit moves you, and then 50 days is going to be Shavuos. How do you know when it says Shabbos, it's specifically referring to the day after Passover. Passover is referred to as Shabbos. So the answer is the oral law. And when you look in the Talmud in Menachos, you'll see it's a 5-way debate. Everybody knows that when the Torah says Shabbos, it means Shavuos. And everybody knows that you count 50 days from Passover, and that's how you get to Shavuos. What don't we know? How we source that and show that Shabbos means Passover. And so one rabbi says, I have this verse. That's the proof. Another rabbi says, no, it can't be that verse because I use that verse for this. So it must be this verse. Another rabbi says, you're crazy. Both those verses are used for this other thing. It must be this verse. We'll put it all together. 5-way debate because everybody knows the oral law. Everybody knows the written law. It's just sourcing the oral law in the written law. Isn't that incredible? We have another example like this by the holiday of Sukkot or Sukkot. It said, the Torah says that everybody knows on Sukkot you shake 4 species, an esrog, and a palm frond, and a hadassah branch, a myrtle branch, and a willow. You take those, bring them together. So in the esrog, the citron, the funky lemon, the very pithy lemon, that would be the beautiful fruit. The problem is the Torah doesn't say esrog. The Torah says a beautiful fruit. So I think kumquats are beautiful, or bananas, or watermelon. Can you imagine shaking a watermelon on Sukkot? It'd be great. How do you know when the Torah says beautiful fruit that's referring to esrog. Same thing. It's a five-way debate. Everybody knows that you use a esrog, a citron on sukkahs. Everybody knows when the Torah says beautiful fruit, it means esrog. But how do you know that beautiful fruit really means that? So one rabbi says it's this verse, another one says that verse, another one says, how can you use those verses? Because I use those verses for this, so it must be this verse over here. In other words, we know the oral law, we know the written law. The joy is putting the pieces together. Isn't that beautiful? All right, so great, fantastic, but how do we know that this is right and it didn't change? So here's where we get amazing. The first point that I want to make, and this is similar to how you know your kindergarten teacher didn't lie to you. Torah is not secret. Keep that in mind. The Torah is not secret. So for example, if you show up in synagogue and you're wearing tefillin wrong, somebody is going to say something. More than that, let's say you're praying and you're praying wrong. Somebody will say something. I'll tell you an amazing story. Actually, it's not such an amazing story, but it illustrates this point very well. So in the Orthodox community, as you may know or may not know, the Orthodox community, the rabbi doesn't lead the services every day. Who leads the services? Some sucker who got stuck leading the services that day. And depending on this community, they either just pull random people out or they have a rotation or whatever it is. But it's regular members of the community who lead the services every day and on the holidays, etc. and so forth. There's a custom in many communities that if a person is in mourning for a parent, so if, God forbid, somebody loses a parent, so you lead the services for the whole year, 11 months, after your parent passes away. And there's different customs, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. So I remember the year that my mother passed away, about 5 years ago. So I led the services the whole year. And I thought I knew how to pray. I'd been praying at that point. I didn't grow up religious, but by the time my mother passed away, I'd been religious over 20 years at that point. I sort of knew I thought I knew what I was doing. And I led the services many times. It wasn't like my first time ever leading service, but so all of a sudden, people, because they were hearing me do it every day, people saying, you said over there. It's really awe. Like the ha, it's really more of a ha kind of stuff. Yeah. In other words, the people who corrected me were not thinking, I have to care about the integrity of the transmission and the oral law, and I have to preserve this. No, I was praying and it sounded wrong to them, and they were motivated to say something. That's the bottom line. People are going to say something because it's not secret. The observance, the way you practice it, is in public. So people are just busybodies and nosy, and they're going to stick their nose into your business to solve the problem. So, okay, they're going to fix you. More than that, there's sometimes economic incentives tied to this as well. So, for example, if you slaughter animals and word gets out that you're not slaughtering the animals correctly, people are going to stop buying your meat, and it's going to destroy your business. And because the community is religious people who care about this stuff, and they want the meat to be slaughtered properly, so you have an economic incentive to make sure you're preserving the integrity of the oral law, that you're learning the laws correctly and you're slaughtering properly, because you don't want your reputation damaged because you're going to lose your business. And that's the same thing for people who write mezuzahs or Torah scrolls or tefillin or any of the other Judaica that's part of our make matzahs, any part of the things that become part of our life. There's an economic incentive tied to the ritual practice or the way to observe to maintain the consistency and the veracity of the oral law. More than that, and this is something that illustrates this point beautifully, is that it's not the exclusive property of a group of elite scholars sitting in Ivy Towers. What's the basis of the oral law? The way it's observed by the masses. So I'm going to tell you a story from the Talmud. This is from Pesachim, page 65a. The Laws of Passover, page 65a in the Babylonian Talmud. And what's fascinating, now this story, it's going to tell a great story. You don't necessarily have to believe the literal words of the story. It's going to teach you a powerful lesson, which is this lesson I'm telling you here. So Hillel, who we mentioned earlier, Hillel wasn't actually from Israel. Hillel was what we today called an Iraqi. He came from, back then it was called Babylon. I guess probably the Persian Empire at that point, but we always call it Bavel in Talmudic language. So Hillel came from there. By the time Hillel moved to Israel, he was an established scholar and a famous person, known. And so when he moved to Israel, the sages there decided that when Hillel shows up, we're going to make him the head of the court, that he's going to become the Nasi, the president of the Sanhedrin, and he's going to be the leader of the Jewish people, but then when he moves to Israel. So very exciting. They also had a problem. What was the problem? The problem was that Passover that year, Seder night was a Saturday night. And so when Passover is on a Saturday night, See, what normally happens is you slaughter your Passover lamb the afternoon before Passover. That night, while you're having your Seder, you barbecue the lamb. And so by the time you get to the point where you're ready to eat the lamb, it's cooked and you can go on with your Seder. When it's on a Saturday, so what happens is you can still slaughter the animal, but you have to sit there with the carcass on the Temple Mount until the sun goes down, so you can then take it home and begin the barbecue and start your Seder. Okay, that's all. Everybody knows that. That was fantastic. The problem was, and this was a big problem, was that getting the knife to slaughter the animal, you were going from one domain to another. So how are the people going to bring their knives up onto the Temple Mount to slaughter their animals? So the sages didn't know. So they figured, well, ask Hillel when Hillel gets there, and he'll explain the problem to us. So sure enough, Hillel comes, and they say, oh, great Hillel, we've got a problem. Passover is on a Saturday night. So how are the people going to get their knives up with the sheep onto the Temple Mount so they can slaughter the sheep, so they can have the animals ready for Seder night? And Hillel says, I don't know. That's a great question. Here's what we'll do. Let's watch and see what the people do, and we'll know from that what the law is. Okay, so that's what they do. So they watch, and sure enough, Passover comes. It's Saturday at Shabbos afternoon before Passover. And what the people do, apparently, I'm not a farmer, so I'm not 100% sure. That's what Talmud says. Sheep have a big, thick tuft of hair or wool in the back of the neck. The people stuck the knives into the wool. The animal carried it up onto the Temple Mount. And that's how they got the knives up there to slaughter the animals. And everybody, oh, so that's the law. Hillel says, see, that's the law. Ooh, there's joy in Mudville. What's the problem with that story? Problem with that story is what? The sages forgot, but the common people knew? And the answer is, don't lose the forest to the trees. Don't look at the literal message of the Torah. Look at the figurative message. What's the Talmud trying to teach us? It's trying to teach us that the preservation, like I said, the preservation of our tradition is not due to a group of elite scholars sitting in their ivory towers dictating the laws to the masses. And that, if it was because of that, the laws would get corrupted and everything would be broken. What's the veracity of our oral law? What guarantees the preservation of our Judaism? How the people observe it. The way it's observed in the masses amongst the people, that's how because it's not secret. It's public information. Everybody knows it. And that's how you know you can trust it. Now, obviously, the people in their ivory towers have a point. They have to be able to master the gray areas. They have to be able to figure things out. Remember, areas of wisdom that may get muddied a little bit because they're not necessarily so common. And they're obviously there as well to decide in cases where you have a bias. So, for example, if there's a lot of money involved, so you're going to obviously have some kind of bias. You need an impartial third party to come and decide those things for you. But the point being that the preservation of the system is not because of the elite scholars, it's because everybody knows it, everybody does it. There are secret things in Judaism as well, and there are secret practices that are not known to the masses, but what's amazing is those are not binding in Jewish law. You can do them and they're cool, but if the daily law contradicts the mystical idea, you go with the daily law. You don't go with the mystical idea. Anyways, capiche? Comprende? Hevantem? Panimayish Verstate? All right, good. Let's move on a little bit more, and then we'll tie this point up because it's a beautiful point. But I want to go on a side tangent for just a second, because this concept of your wisdom not being secret information, but being something that's common to everybody, it's not exclusive to the Jewish people. Lots of cultures and societies have this. For example, there's a picture of Alex Haley. Alex Haley is a famous author. He was actually the person who Malcolm X dictated his biography to. Autobiography of Malcolm X was edited and written basically by Alex Haley. And Alex Haley in the 70s had put out a work called Roots. It also was the first television miniseries. And it was a story, he's an African-American man, and it was the story of his family tracing his lineage back to the village in Africa where the family originally came from. In the family, if you've watched the show, read the book, you'll know, in the family, they had a tradition that the name of the original slave who was brought over from Africa, his name was Kunta Kinte. Now it's passed down father to daughter, aunt and uncle, whatever it was, to cousins. And so the family knew this name, Kunta Kinte. That was the name of the original slave brought over from Africa. Okay, fantastic. Alex Haley is doing this research. And he had a hunch. He found an area in Gambia, in modern-day West Africa. He had a northwest Africa where the family might be, and he went to go check it out. In North Africa, if you ever study ethnomusicology and learn about the musics that go on in that part of the world, so they have a tradition called the griot tradition. Griot, I think it is Griot. Griot. The griot is the name of the instrument that's played as well as the person who plays that instrument. The griot is kind of like a guitar. The person who plays it, the griot, plays that and also sings. And the function of the griot, the person who plays it, is as the tribe historian. How do you become a griot? You can only be a griot if your father is a griot, father to son. And you have to train for years before you can finally perform in public. But what's fascinating is that you're singing over the history of the tribe. And when you do it in public, if you mess up, how do you know how it'll get corrected so you don't mess up and it doesn't get a corruption in the transmission? Everybody's heard these stories already. This is the tribe history. Old people have been going to these ceremonies for years. So you mess up, you give over the wrong version of the story, you say the wrong name of the king or whatever, there'll be some elderly person in the back saying, that's not the name of the king. This is the name of the king. So the thing gets preserved. Anyways, Alex Haley makes his way over to this part of Africa, and they take him to one of these ceremonies where there's the griot playing, and it goes on for hours. In the show, he falls asleep, whatever. Anyways, it goes on for hours and hours, and he's there with the guy playing the instrument and singing the history, and another guy translating into English. Eventually, they get to this point. It's about 300 years ago, and the chief's son, Kunta Kinte, goes off into the woods to get some wood to make a drum and never came home. And Alex Haley goes, what? Say that again? And they go, the chief's son, Kunta Kinte, goes, Kunta Kinte, it's my family. And everybody gets up and they hug, and it's very beautiful. What's the point? The point is that a large body of information can be transmitted accurately within a given society because it's not secret information. It's public knowledge. Everybody knows it already. That's beautiful. And that's not just true in other cultures, it's true in Judaism as well. One thing that's amazing is that we live in a magical time now, an ingathering of the exiles, where if you go to the modern state of Israel, so you'll find communities, people who've been living isolated in places like Poland or Lithuania or wherever for hundreds of years, and they're now living on the same block as people from Yemen or Iraq or Syria or wherever, and they're basically keeping the same Judaism. It's okay, they have different pronunciation, different songs, there's other customs that may have creeped in, but at the end of the day, it's the same religion. They're doing the same thing. Their kids can marry each other. They'll eat in each other's kitchens. Unbelievable, isn't it? It's kind of a beautiful proof because this stuff is preserved because this stuff is preserved in public by people who care about it, and there's economic incentives that's attached to it. We see that over thousands of years, even like a community like Yemen was separated from the rest of the community for over 2,000 years. You come together, it's the same Judaism. Unbelievable, okay? Why was it kept oral? So it's kept oral for many reasons, and I won't go into it 100%. But number one, keeping it oral, first of all, if it wasn't oral, it'd be this massive body of information, which we now have that was written down. But originally, if it wasn't kept oral, by keeping it oral, you keep it relevant. You keep it relevant. It used to be that when you'd explain, nowadays, you want to explain to somebody what happens after you die. So how do you explain? You give a relevant example. You say they sit in a room, you watch a movie of your life. Okay. Woo! How would they say that 100 years ago? It wouldn't be a movie, it'd be something else. More than that, though, but you have an example that's relevant to your generation, you can explain the concepts. More than that, once we set things in stone and we use ancient examples, you first have to understand the example to understand the principle, and it becomes archaic, which is problematic. Makes it challenging and difficult to truly understand the law. I'll give you an example. For example, we have a case in Jewish Torah law that if your animal causes damage to my inanimate object, my property in the public domain, so there's a way to adjudicate that situation and to understand that law. So it used to be, in the old days, that we'd explain like this: I have my earthenware vessel, which I've placed on the street to sell, and you're walking your cow through the market and it crushes my earthenware vessel. So you start yelling, hey! Well, I start yelling, hey, watch where you go with your cow. And you say, hey, don't be such an idiot leaving your earthenware vessels lying in the street. Okay, but nowadays we don't relate to earthenware vessels and cows. So how do we adjudicate that law? How do we determine what the value is that you have to pay? So I tell you now, we're standing in the street, talking, you've got your dog, I've got my dry cleaning. And while we're speaking, your dog makes an accident on my dry cleaning. So I start screaming, hey, watch your dog. And you say, hey, it's public area. You should be careful with your dry cleaning. Get it? Same exact situation, same way that you determine payment, but completely different given the analogies, the examples. So we have to keep it oral. It makes it much more relevant. Also, as new technologies are developed and new things happen, so we have to be able to apply those. If we have principles that are oral, it's much easier to apply them to the changing times. Once upon a time, Jews were slaves in Egypt, so they wrote on papyrus. Then they moved to Mesopotamia, where writing was now on cuneiform tablets or cuneiform tablets. Are the tablets in Mesopotamia, is that still considered writing the same way as papyrus? We have a principle, it's oral, we can figure it out. When electricity was invented and became common usage, computers, they became, how do these things apply within our system or our corpus of law? By keeping it oral, you're able to keep it in there and stick it in there. More than that, by keeping it oral, you can't just know it on your own. It's something which has to be studied, discussed, and debated to be remembered, which takes us to our next point, which is, why is it oral? Keeping it oral forces you to have a teacher. By having a teacher, like we said with learning the language, anything, it's impossible to really understand the oral law, understand Judaism without a teacher to show you how to do it. If you were to just pick up an English translation of the Talmud and read and never go to a class and never have a teacher, there's a good chance you'll never really figure it out. You'll know what the words mean, but to understand the style of learning and what the function words mean and how the things flow, it's impossible without a teacher. I think if somebody's new to Judaism, you still need a good 2 years in yeshiva of study to be able to learn with an English translation. You have to have that student-teacher relationship. It's impossible without it. I'll tell you a fascinating story. When I was many years ago, I ended up in Egypt. And so I was new to Judaism, just learning about Judaism. And so I was fascinated with religion. So I met a Muslim, religious Muslim, and I said, teach me about Islam. So he taught me 2 things. First thing he taught me were the 5 pillars of Islam, which I won't tell you now. I still remember them, orally transmitted. He's telling me the 5 pillars of Islam. And then the other thing he told me was the following. He says, you have to learn the Quran with a guide. He meant the teacher, but his English wasn't great. So he said, you have to have a guide when you learn the Quran. Why? Because you're going to read the Quran, it's going to say the word white, and you're going to think it means white, but it means black. And if you don't have someone to teach you, to show you that in context, when it says white, it really means black, you'll end up completely misunderstanding the Quran and come up with all these crazy cockamamie ideas. You ever read, like, scholars and intellectuals who aren't religious, like the way they interpret the Torah on their own without a teacher? It's crazy. What are you saying? We're academics. Where are you getting this from? It's because you don't have a guide. You don't have a teacher to show you. When I was in college, I have a degree in music, like we mentioned earlier. So when I was in college, if somebody was playing a solo and played a great solo, the greatest compliment you could pay that person is say, that solo was bad. That was bad. Now, if you didn't understand context, you'd be like, why did you just insult him? That was a great solo. Why did you say it was bad? You get it? You have to understand context. You have to have a teacher who's going to show this to you, to show you how to do it. Even when they started writing down the oral law, which we'll explain in a second why they did that, they wrote it down in a way that it's really impossible to study and understand without a teacher. You have the principles, but you need a teacher to show you the way in order you understand the things properly. I want you to show me the way every day. All right, anyways, final thing I want to keep in mind is, what about all the debates? What about all the debates that are in the Talmud? So we can go on and on and on about debates and why they debate and everything like that. Bottom line with the debates in the Talmud is the following. The people who wrote the Talmud knew the answers and the conclusions to the debates before they wrote them down. Obviously, the debates were like, oh my gosh, we're writing this book and there's an argument. What's going on? Obviously, they encoded it that way on purpose. It's a pedagogical device. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Since nobody's here able to comment in the chat, let's just say, yeah, it's a pedagogical device. Pedagogical, it's done that way on purpose. How come? Because when you write something in the style of an argument, in a way of debate, you'll find as you read it, naturally you take sides. If you're learning it with or studying it with somebody else, naturally, if you take one side, your contrarian partner will probably take the other side, and you'll find yourself arguing it out. By taking sides and arguing it out, it keeps it vibrant, it keeps it alive, it keeps it relevant, it helps you remember it, enables you to inculcate these concepts in your kishkas so you'll know them and live with them. And that's really the whole point. You want to be able to understand and know these things and live these things, so you debate them and discuss them, and that's how you get your hand and your head wrapped around these things so they become inside. All right, good. I won't do any more with the debate. So final thing is, where and when was it written down? So at some point they realized, if we don't write this thing down, it's going to get lost. So generally speaking, the first 1,500 years of Jewish history, you had a written law and an oral law, and you grew up in your village, wherever in Israel, and your teacher who was teaching you how to read the Aleph base was teaching you some of the more difficult concepts. Eventually, if you're one of the better students, they sent you off to one of the main academies. You come back home now, and that's the way these things were learned. In the days of the Roman Empire, the later days, after the destruction of the Second Temple, after the crushing of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, where you're starting to have the beginnings of a Jewish diaspora and a significant diaspora. So the sages of that day realized that if we don't start right, and they're starting to get some debates in there, again, on the periphery, on gray areas, the major principles of what Judaism is, everybody basically agreed on. But the fringe ideas are starting to get lost. They realized if we don't encode this and write it down, it's going to get lost forever. So that's what they did. I won't go to the whole story because this is a class in of itself, how they put together this work. But the first work they put together was the Mishnah. The Mishnah are just the principles of the oral law, the legal principles of the oral law. You could learn the entire Mishnah and still not know what to do, not know anything, but you will know all the principles. It's written in a way that's easy to memorize. Actually questionable if they wrote it or they just organized it, but it's written in a way that's easy to memorize. There's a cadence to it. There's sometimes phrases in there that are just there for the rhyme, or not the rhythm, not really rhyme, but for the rhythm. And it's designed in a way that you can't learn it, understand it without a teacher. So that's the first chunk, the Mishnah. Then came the Gemara. The Gemara is the explanation of the Mishnah. It's not an interpretation. It's an explanation. And so it'll tell you, the Gemara, there's two, but the main Gemara we studied today was about 300 years later, finalized in the year 474 with the death of Ravina. Ravina and Rav Ashi were the two people who compiled the Talmud, Babylonian Talmud. But anyways, the Gemara, it'll look at a Mishnah, and it will establish authorship of that Mishnah. It'll establish the sources, define the terms, ask obvious contradictions from logic internally, contradictions from other sources, contemporary sources, logical questions, and it explain both sides. And sometimes it's a little frustrating because it'll explain one side, explain the other side, and then change the subject. It's not going to give you a conclusion. It's just going to explain what the Mishnah is saying. Then it moves on. A Gemara is an explanation of a Mishnah. You can have a Mishnah without a Gemara, but you can't have a Gemara without a Mishnah. Put the Mishnah and Gemara together and you have the Talmud. That's what the Talmud is. Midrash is learning things by implication. Mishnah is learning things, Midrash is learning things by implication. And this, and generally speaking, the great collections we have of Midrashim, of these explanations of things by implication, follow the difference between them and the Talmud. The Talmud follows its own system, its own structure. The Midrash follows the verses of the Torah and the books of the Bible. And it goes in order as they appear. Most Midrash is not the crazy stories that people tell, though that's a big part of it. But most Midrash is wordplay. It's just showing you this word's used here. It's used in context 3 other places in the rest of the written law. So how do we put it together? How do we have a definitive understanding of what this word really means? The final area is what we call Kabbalah. It's the mystical teachings, telling the depths and the deep understandings of what the Talmud, giving you a deeper appreciation and understanding of what's going on beyond just the surface and beyond just the letter of the law. Finally, and this is the point, like we said, the oral law is the essence of Judaism. What Moses got at Mount Sinai was the oral law. It's how you live and practice the religion. The written law is a very specific outline to guarantee you don't forget the essence of Judaism, which is the oral law. But when you understand this, like I said, it makes sense because the written law, it's written like an outline. So all that vague, missing info, hints, weird juxtapositions, grammatical oddities, all those things, they make sense when you look at it as an outline. If you look at it as a book, a little bit weird. You look at it as an outline, not weird, but difficult to understand and get your head around. But you look at it as an outline, makes perfect sense. What's fascinating is great rabbis, at the end of their lives, after they spent their entire lives internalizing the totality of their oral law, what are they studying? They just study the 5 books of Moses, the Chumash. They study the outline because they read through the outline, and that triggers all the depth and all the oral law and all the essence of what Judaism is. And it's fantastic. And it's amazing. They tell this famous story of the Vilna Gaon, the great rabbi from Vilna who died just before 1797 or so. That's as an older man, he was a prodigy as a child who mastered the entirety of Talmud and mystical teachings and spent his entire life immersed in study. At the end of his life, he just studied Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, because he just had to go through the outline to remind himself of the totality of Judaism. The rest of us, we study the oral law till we die. Okay, and that's the bottom line. That's what Judaism is. So how do we know our oral law is right? Because it's a living body that we've practiced as a people through the entirety of our history. It's not secret, and it's not secret. There's financial incentives and connected to it. And we see when the Jewish people get back together after all our years of exile and wandering, we're still practicing the same thing in the same way, with some, differences, discrepancies for custom, pronunciation, songs, and spicy food. That's basically it. So I hope that was informative. Like I said, my name is Tzvi Gluckin. I want you to stay in touch with me. You can follow me on Twitter. I am the real Tzvi. There's fake Tzvis out there. Don't follow them. I'm the real Tzvi. I spelled Tzvi the proper way, Tzvi. You can also follow me on Instagram if that floats your boat. Facebook, I have a professional page, which is facebook.com/Tzvi Gluckin, my name. If you friend me, I probably won't add you because I've got issues. But if you follow my professional page, Tzvi Gluckin, then we can be hooked up that way. And if you're into music and Judaism, go to my site, theingathering.substack.com. That's the ingathering, like Kibbutz Galios, theingathering.substack.com. New issue coming out every Tuesday. It's free. Who doesn't like free? So that's that. Check it out, everybody. I hope this was informative, interesting, understanding, and life-changing. And if people have questions, reach out to me on social media, one of those places. And until then, have an amazing night. Stay out of trouble. I think you're special.